Welcome to the Discernment Drop. Pull up a chair, get comfortable, and prepare to have your illusions of modern freedom thoroughly, yet politely, dismantled.
Yes, thoroughly dismantled.
You are joining us as the third intellectual partner in this exploration, and frankly, we are thrilled you're here. Today, we are undertaking a mission to bypass the usual technological paranoia.
Right. We want to avoid that entirely.
Exactly. We are skipping past the exhausting, apocalyptic sensationalism that seems to just dominate every conversation you hear about the future of commerce, digital currencies, and the dreaded algorithms.
Because that panic doesn't actually help anyone understand what's really happening.
No, it doesn't. So instead, we are opting for a highly rigorous, sober, and perhaps slightly cynical examination of how economic systems throughout human history, and especially the ones you interact with every single day, leverage the simple ability to buy and sell to demand your ultimate human allegiance.
It is a fascinating and, frankly, a deeply recurring pattern. We have this tendency as modern digitally connected people to look back at history with this sense of immense superiority.
Oh, the superiority complex is staggering.
It really is. We think we have evolved past the crude mechanisms of ancient empires, but what we completely miss is that the underlying mechanisms of control haven't actually disappeared. They've merely evolved.
Right.
They've become digitized, sanitized, and neatly packaged in an end-user license agreement that we just blindly accept so we can watch a new streaming series.
Yeah, we sit around congratulating ourselves on brilliantly abolishing feudalism. We look back at medieval peasants and think, oh, you poor land-bound serfs, chained to the whims of a capricious lord, how archaic.
Right. Look at those backwards people.
Meanwhile, we happily carry around tracking devices that cheerfully inform us we just bought a movie when the terms of service, which none of us read, let's be honest, clearly state we are merely renting temporary, revocable access from our new digital lords in Silicon Valley.
A stunning bit of cognitive dissonance.
It is. We celebrate the death of the monarch while paying a monthly subscription to heat the seats in the car we supposedly own.
Which is precisely why our foundational text for today's analysis is so crucial. It cuts right through that illusion of modern exceptionalism.
It does. And to set the stage properly for you listening, according to the sermon by Pastor John L. Widdifield titled The Marketplace of Allegiance, a Christian examination of economic control in the age of systems, this modern predicament isn't a new glitch in the matrix.
Not at all.
This is the ancient operating system of human civilization. The core thesis here is that economic leverage has always been the preferred tool of empires to extract worship and compliance.
And the progression of that control, as outlined in the text, is as predictable as it is grim. Pastor John frames it not as a technological crisis, but as a structural reality of human power dynamics. He outlines a very specific escalation.
Let's walk through that escalation.
First, you have the most basic level. If a centralized power can control the food supply, they control the population.
Right, that's just sheer biological leverage.
Exactly, it's the siege tactic. Second, if they can abstract that and control the money supply, the currency itself, they control the broader economy. But there is an ultimate tier, an apex of systemic leverage that goes beyond just holding the grain or minting the coins.
Okay, let me pause you there, because intuitively, controlling the food seems like the absolute apex. I mean, if I control whether you eat, I control you. Why is there a tier above that?
Because controlling the food is a brute force metric. And it is incredibly resource intensive to maintain. You have to guard the silos, you have to physically distribute the rations.
It sounds expensive.
Very expensive. And you invite immediate violent rebellion because the oppression is overt. People can see the guards holding the food. But the apex tier, controlling the ability to buy and sell, is far more elegant.
Elegance is a terrifying word to use there.
But it is. If you can control the marketplace infrastructure itself, you control a person's participation in society without ever having to physically hoard their food. You don't need to put a guard at their door. You just excommunicate them from the network of exchange. It becomes self-policing.
Ah, I see. You outsource the enforcement to the system itself.
Precisely.
Which leads us directly into one of the most notoriously misunderstood, heavily sensationalized verses in all of human literature. Revelation 13:17.
Yes, the famous one.
The ominous warning that a time would come, quote, so that no one can buy or sell unless he has the mark. Now, let's just acknowledge the sheer volume of wild speculation this single sentence has spawned over the centuries. It's practically a cottage industry of panic.
It truly is. The historical track record of interpreting that specific verse is a masterclass in human projection.
Yeah.
Every single generation looks at whatever new economic or technological system makes them feel vulnerable and immediately shouts, aha, this is it, the mark.
Right. I mean, during the Middle Ages, you had peasants utterly convinced that the mark was a reference to the new, oppressive, feudal taxation systems being imposed upon them. They looked at the local tax collector's ledger and saw the apocalypse.
And then the reformers came along.
Yep. And they pointed fingers at the economic pressures applied by state churches. Jump to the 20th century and readers are sweating over totalitarian regimes, then barcodes on grocery store items.
The barcodes were a big one.
Huge. Then credit cards, and eventually subcutaneous microchips.
And while the anxiety is understandable, it completely misses the actual historical reality of the first century. The text forces us to look at the world the original recipients of the book of Revelation were living in.
And they weren't worrying about barcodes.
No, they were living under the suffocating, all-encompassing authority of the Roman Empire. And Rome wasn't just a political state with borders, tax collectors, and a standing army. It was a comprehensive religious system that expected and structurally demanded symbolic loyalty from its subjects.
The imperial cult. But let's clarify what that actually looked like on the ground, because I think modern people misunderstand the nature of ancient pagan worship.
They absolutely do.
For the average Roman citizen, participating in the imperial cult, let's say, burning a little pinch of incense before a statue of the emperor, wasn't necessarily this deep, emotional, spiritual awakening. It wasn't a tearful altar call where they genuinely believed the emperor stitched the cosmos together.
Exactly. For the vast majority of the empire's subjects, it was purely administrative. It was a civic oath of loyalty.
It was the ancient equivalent of putting your hand over your heart for the national anthem at a baseball game, just with a few more pagan deities and open flames involved.
That is a perfect analogy.
So let me play devil's advocate for a second. If it's just a civic duty, a bureaucratic box to check, why were the early Christians so incredibly stubborn about it? Why not just burn the incense, wink at your friends, know in your heart you don't mean it, and go about your day?
Because for the early Christians, that rationalization was an agonizing, absolute impossibility. To burn the incense, to publicly declare Caesar as Lord, even just as a formality, was to commit overt idolatry.
Right.
It was to give the ultimate allegiance, an allegiance that belonged exclusively to God, to a political system. It was a failure of witness. And the Romans, for their part, didn't just shrug and say, okay, you guys are weird, but to each their own.
No, Rome was not known for its easygoing tolerance of dissent.
Exactly. The genius of the Roman system was that refusal had severe systemic economic consequences. It wasn't just that you might get thrown to the lions, it was that you couldn't feed your family long before the lions were ever involved.
Which brings us to the trade guilds. And this is where the genius of Pastor John's analysis really shines, because it grounds this apocalyptic imagery in daily, mundane economic reality.
It brings it right down to earth.
If you want to understand Roman trade guilds, imagine a modern professional networking platform. Think of a highly exclusive LinkedIn. But before you can accept a connection request or post a job listing, you have to attend a mandatory networking mixer where the CEO demands you participate in a blood sacrifice to the patron god of commerce.
It's a vivid analogy and highly accurate. If you were a silversmith in Ephesus, or a tent maker in Corinth, or a merchant in Thyatira, doing business wasn't a free market enterprise.
You couldn't just hang a shingle and start selling.
No. To get raw materials from suppliers, to secure a stall in the central marketplace, to get favorable contracts, you had to be a member in good standing of the local trade guild.
And those guilds didn't just hold boring quarterly meetings reviewing the budget.
Not at all. They held regular festivals, banquets, and feasts dedicated to their specific patron deities, and invariably to the genius of the emperor. The meat served at these banquets had been sacrificed to idols. The opening invocations were prayers to pagan gods.
So the dilemma was right there in their face.
Yes, for a Christian merchant, the dilemma was immediate, daily, and existential. If your theological convictions prevented you from participating in the imperial cult or the guild banquets, you were systematically excluded.
You're banned from the flour supplier. your ancient Yelp page is deleted.
Precisely. You were socially marginalized. You were cut off from the economic lifeblood of your community. You couldn't buy raw materials. You couldn't sell your finished goods. And this is the core takeaway of that famous warning in Revelation.
It's so clear when you put it like that.
The mark wasn't a warning about future technology. It was a present-day symbol of public allegiance to a system that explicitly used economic leverage to demand worshipful loyalty.
It wasn't about gadgets. It was about power. It was about a system looking at a human being and saying, if you want to feed your children, if you want to participate in the survival of your family, you must first bow the knee to our ideology.
And that realization raises a profound question.
What's that?
If the core issue isn't the specific technology, if it's not the microchip or the barcode, but rather the underlying strategy of using economic dependency to secure allegiance, how has this strategy evolved since Rome fell?
Because it certainly didn't stop with Rome.
No, it didn't, because as the sermon meticulously details, Rome was hardly the first nor the last civilization to deploy this tactic. In fact, subsequent empires internalized a very dark, very pragmatic truth. Brute force is exhausting, economic dependency is vastly cheaper, and often far more effective.
It's the illusion of enlightenment that we suffer from today. We look back at history and think the arc of the moral universe has magically eradicated these structures. We say, well, we don't have literal chains anymore. We abolished absolute monarchies. We passed labor laws. We are free.
But the reality is much more subtle.
Exactly. What actually happened is that the power structures just got better at math.
Yeah.
Why bear the enormous logistical, military, and moral cost of literally owning a human being when you can just own the conditions of their survival?
That is the pivotal shift. Let's examine this historical matrix, because seeing the repetition of this pattern is vital to understanding our current moment.
Yeah, let's go granular here. If we skip over the mechanics, we miss the horror of it. Let's start with feudal Europe. So the Roman Empire collapses. You have the rise of the manorial system. You have lords, knights, and peasants. Now, if the lord doesn't legally own the peasant's physical body, they aren't chattel slaves in the ancient sense.
Mm-hmm.
How does the system actually enforce compliance without keeping them in physical chains?
The mechanism of control shifted to land tenure. The nobility held the ultimate title to the land, granted by the crown, and they allowed the peasants, the serfs, the quote-unquote privilege of using it.
The very conditional privilege.
Highly conditional. The peasants owed a massive portion of their harvest to the lord, alongside mandatory unpaid labor on the lord's personal estate, called the domain, and various other tributes and taxes.
So the lord doesn't need to shackle the peasant to the plow. The lord just owns the dirt the peasant needs to grow the wheat, so the peasant doesn't starve to death when winter comes.
Exactly. If the peasant decides to rebel or withhold his allegiance or dispute the lord's authority, the lord doesn't necessarily need to send an executioner or a garrison of soldiers. He just exercises his legal right of eviction.
He expels the peasant from the land.
Yes. In a pre-industrial agrarian society, being landless and without a patron was effectively a death sentence. The system functions flawlessly through economic obligation. The looming threat of winter starvation does the heavy lifting that iron chains used to do.
And what's wild is that humanity looked at that, eventually dismantled the feudal system, went through the Enlightenment, fought wars for liberty, and then essentially reinvented the exact same dynamic centuries later in the sharecropping systems of the American South.
The parallels are truly chilling. Following the American Civil War, slavery, the overt, literal, and legal ownership of persons, was constitutionally abolished, but the underlying macroeconomic desire of the ruling class for cheap, controllable, captive agricultural labor had not vanished.
The desire was still there.
Exactly. So the system simply adapted its leverage.
Explain the actual mechanics of that adaptation, because I think a lot of people just view sharecropping as renting a farm, which sounds fairly benign. Why was it a trap?
It was a trap built on the Croplean system and the weaponization of debt. Freedmen and many poor white farmers as well now worked land owned by others. They didn't pay cash rent. They paid with a share of the crop they produced, usually cotton.
But they started the season with nothing.
Right. They needed seeds, mules, plows, and food to survive the growing season.
And I'm guessing the landowner was more than happy to provide those for a price.
Precisely. The landowners, or merchants working in tandem with them, advanced these supplies on credit at exorbitant, unregulated interest rates, often 50% or 60%. At the end of the harvest, the crop was weighed and sold by the landowner, not the farmer.
Oh, wow.
The landowner kept their share and then deducted the cost of the advanced supplies plus that crushing interest from the sharecropper's portion.
Let me guess the math on this. By some miraculous coincidence of accounting, the sharecropper always owed just a little bit more than their share of the cotton was actually worth.
Year after year, it was a closed loop of debt, mathematically engineered to be inescapable. And the laws of the time made it illegal for a sharecropper to leave the land if they owed a debt to the landowner.
So you have a family legally tied to a piece of land for generations. A child is born into a debt they never accrued, owing allegiance to a landowner they didn't choose, simply because the mechanics of their economic survival are entirely controlled by the ledger.
That's it, exactly.
Again, no literal ownership of the human being is required if you have absolute control over their economic survival.
Which brings us to the industrial age where the rural agrarian trap gets urbanized, the phenomenon of the company town.
This might be one of the most dystopian, audacious examples of this principle in all of modern history. Set the scene for us. What exactly is a company town?
Imagine a massive mining operation, say, coal in Appalachia, or the Pullman Palace Car Company town outside Chicago in the late 19th century. The company builds the factory or the mine in an isolated area. To attract workers, they build the entire town.
They build everything.
Everything. They own the houses, the streets, the water supply, the schools, the library, and most importantly, they own the company store.
Okay, but surely the workers were getting paid wages. If they didn't like the rent, they could just save up their money and move, right?
And here is where the mechanism of control shifts yet again. In many of these towns, the workers were not paid in US dollars. They were paid in company scrip.
Wait, break that down for the listener. What exactly is company scrip?
It was a proprietary currency, tokens, paper money, or credit ledgers issued by the employer. It was entirely legally worthless anywhere outside the geographic boundaries of the company town. You could only spend it at the stores owned by the company that issued it.
Let's really pause and think about the sheer, unadulterated audacity of that. You pour your sweat and blood into a coal mine for 13 hours a day, inhaling dust, risking your life. And at the end of the week, the company pays you in monopoly money that they printed in their own back room.
That's exactly what it was.
You take that monopoly money to the grocery store, which they own, to buy bread and medicine at a price that they set, often marked up 20 to 30% higher than independent stores in other towns.
And the leverage it gave the employer was absolute. Consider the famous Pullman strike of 1894. During an economic depression, George Pullman cut his workers' wages by 25%.
But let me guess, he didn't cut the rent on the company-owned houses they lived in.
He did not. Rents and prices at the company store remained exactly the same. The workers were starving. When they finally formed a committee to protest and ask for rent reductions to match the wage cuts, Pullman hired them.
Just fire them on the spot.
Yes. And in a company town, firing someone means you also instantly evict them from their home because their housing is tied to their employment. Furthermore, any savings they had accumulated in company scrip were instantly rendered worthless because they were no longer part of the company ecosystem.
If we synthesize these historical case studies, the Roman guilds, the feudal manors, the sharecropper's ledger, the company town scrip, a glaring, undeniable principle emerges. In every single era, the specific mechanism changes. The technology of oppression updates.
Yes, the tools get sharper.
But the result is flawlessly consistent. Control access to a person's livelihood, and their allegiance will inevitably follow. No physical change are required when economic survival is conditional upon total compliance.
And this historical foundation is critical because it strips away our modern naivete. It prepares us to face the uncomfortable reality of the contemporary economy.
Right. And here is where it gets incredibly uncomfortable for you, the modern listener, sitting there with your smartphone, your smartwatch, and your dozen monthly subscriptions.
It's a hard pivot to look at our own lives.
It is. Because the scary part of Pastor John's analysis is the realization that we haven't evolved past this tactic. We've just digitized it. We've moved from the physical ownership of land and the printing of company scrip to the control of invisible digital infrastructure. Welcome to the great license swindle of the 21st century.
It truly is a remarkable linguistic and structural sleight of hand. For the vast majority of human history, commerce was fundamentally based on the concept of ownership and transfer of property.
You buy a thing, you own the thing.
Right. You exchange currency for a durable good, A book, a tool, a piece of art, and that good legally belongs to you. You possess it. You can modify it, sell it, or pass it down to your children. But the modern variation, what economists and tech executives euphemistically call the access economy, has fundamentally rewired the relationship between human beings and the things they need to live.
I want to enthusiastically and perhaps a bit cynically unpack this shift, because it happened so quietly that most of us didn't even notice the trap closing around us.
Yeah.
Think about your life right now compared to 20 years ago. We used to own media.
Physical media, yes.
You bought a CD, you bought a DVD, you had physical shelves lined with your property. Now, we stream it from a server. We used to own software. You went to a big box electronics store. You bought a CD-ROM in a ridiculously oversized cardboard box. You installed it on your computer, and that version of the word processor was yours forever.
And now?
Now, you subscribe to it as a service for $20 a month. We used to own our personal data. It lived on a spinning hard drive on your physical desk. Now, a platform hosts it in a climate-controlled server farm 1,000 miles away.
And the sermon highlights a brilliant, almost invisible tactic used by the architects of this system, the linguistic trick.
Oh, this is fascinating.
The consumers, we still culturally and psychologically use the word buy. The interfaces are designed to make us feel like we are acquiring property. You click a brightly colored button on a digital storefront that literally says buy movie or buy album.
But you're actually buying it.
No. If you actually read the fine print, the end-user license agreement, the lawyers have quietly, meticulously replaced the legal concept of buying with the concept of licensing.
Yes. You didn't buy that movie. You purchased a highly conditional, temporary, and entirely revocable license to view a string of data stored on a server that belongs to a massive tech conglomerate.
But let's introduce some friction here, because the tech industry has a very standard defense for this. A software developer would argue, look, this isn't a grand conspiracy to control you. We license software as a service because modern technology requires constant security patches, server upkeep, and updates. You aren't being controlled. You are just paying for continuous, necessary maintenance.
That's the devil's advocate position, right? I'm just paying the digital utility bill. Relax.
But the implication of this shift from ownership to licensing goes far beyond mere maintenance. Ownership transfers absolute sovereign control to you, the buyer.
That's the key difference, control. If you own a physical printed book, the publisher cannot sneak into your house in the middle of the night, pick the lock, and rip out chapter 4 because they decided, retroactively, that it violated their new corporate community guidelines.
Exactly, and that is the vital distinction. Licensing retains ultimate control with the provider. What's fascinating here is the realization that if your account disappears or if your access is revoked, your content disappears.
Poof, gone.
The digital library you spent thousands of dollars acquiring over a decade can be vaporized in a millisecond if an automated system flags your account for a terms of service violation.
But let's be real. Most people can survive without their digital movie collection. That's an annoyance. Where this shifts from an annoyance to a systemic crisis is when we look at the broader infrastructure. Pastor John broadens the lens to look at the underlying systems of our entire society.
We aren't just talking about entertainment anymore.
No, we are talking about banking infrastructure, digital payment networks, identity verification platforms, cloud hosting services, online marketplaces.
These are no longer merely individual businesses competing in a free market. They have become the literal arteries of modern commerce.
They are the circulatory system of our daily existence.
Yeah.
Let's put this in perspective for the listener. If you are a small business owner today, and you are suddenly inexplicably disconnected from your digital payment processor, your business effectively ceases to exist.
Instantly.
You can have the best artisan coffee or custom software in the world. You can have hundreds of customers lined up outside your physical or digital door. But if the digital artery is severed, you cannot participate in the economy. You cannot process a transaction.
And if a centralized power, whether that is a corporate board of directors, an activist employee base, or a government regulator applying back-channel pressure to that board, controls those arteries, they control your participation in society.
And we are back to Rome.
Once again, looking back to Rome, looking back to the company town, no iron chains required, no troops in the streets, just the threat of turning off your digital access.
Which brings us to the concept of algorithmic governance, and what the source material calls the ethical crisis of convenience. Because we have to be intellectually honest here. We didn't get forced into this access economy at gunpoint. We sprinted into it with open arms because it is incredibly, intoxicatingly efficient.
It is undeniably convenient. The access economy gives us seamless, over-the-air software updates overnight. We don't have to maintain our own complex server racks. The distribution of goods and digital media is entirely frictionless. Fraud detection on our credit cards happens in milliseconds, protecting our assets.
We opted in because two-day shipping and unlimited streaming are awesome.
But the trap is that we traded our fundamental autonomy for that convenience. We essentially handed over the keys to our economic survival in exchange for a smoother user experience.
And that trade-off introduces a terrifying structural difference between the past and the present: the velocity and scale of revocable access.
The speed at which it can happen. Exactly. If we connect this to the bigger picture, taking away a piece of physical property is legally and practically difficult. It requires due process. It requires a judge, a court order, a sheriff, and physical force to execute an eviction or seize assets.
But digital access. Give us an ELI 5. Explain it like I'm 5 on how algorithmic governance actually works in practice, because people hear that phrase and think of the Terminator.
When we say algorithmic governance, we aren't talking about a sentient AI plotting our demise. We're talking about massive spreadsheets interacting with application programming interfaces APIs. Imagine a massive automated flowchart running millions of times a second.
Okay, I'm picturing a giant flowchart.
A payment processor's code scans your transactions. If the code detects that your business triggered a newly updated, highly subjective, acceptable use violation, a script fires. It's a simple if-then statement. If flagged, then freeze funds.
And just like that, the lights go out.
Your account is locked. Your digital storefront is deleted. Your communication platforms are silenced. There is no judge. There is no jury. There is just a string of code executing its parameters.
And Pastor John drops a phenomenal, haunting quote here that should send a shiver down the spine of anyone paying attention. Capabilities have a habit of eventually being used. We build these incredibly powerful centralized systems capable of excommunicating a person from the modern economy with a mouse click. And we just cross our fingers and hope the people running those systems will always be benevolent, fair, and perfectly aligned with our own personal moral values.
It is historically naive in the extreme, especially when we consider the rapid ongoing integration of identity and commerce. We are currently witnessing the rise of systems where your digital identity, your financial resources, your social credit, and institutional policy are inextricably fused together.
A completely tangled web.
In the past, if you broke a rule or violated a policy, there was a deliberative human process. A trial, a hearing, a debate where you could present context. Now, rules are increasingly enforced automatically. The code is the law.
You try to process a payment, and the transaction simply fails. You try to call customer service, and there is no human being to appeal to, just an automated chatbot telling you that your access has been permanently revoked due to an unspecified violation of Section 4, Paragraph B, and that this decision is final.
Which leads us to the quiet ethical question of our age.
And I want to pose this question directly to you listening right now. Look at your life, your business, your digital footprint, your bank accounts. Who ultimately decides the conditions under which you may participate in economic life? Is it you?
Is it your local physical community?
Or is it a handful of executives and automated systems operating in a boardroom you will never see in a city you don't live in? Because the answer to that question determines whether these incredible technological systems are going to serve human dignity or quietly, efficiently reshape it into something far more compliant.
To navigate out of this despair, Pastor John shifts gears into a high-level theological synthesis that completely upends how most modern people think about property, rights, and economics.
It's a total paradigm shift.
He contrasts this algorithmic centralized control with the ancient biblical concept of stewardship versus ownership. And what's fascinating here is that Scripture fundamentally rejects the modern Western libertarian concept of absolute human ownership.
Let me push back on that, because the idea that I earned this with my own two hands, I bought it with my wages, it is mine, and I have absolute sovereign control over it, is basically the bedrock of the American dream. Are you saying the text contradicts that entirely?
The text provides the ultimate radical counter-narrative to those cultural assumptions. The sermon points us to Psalm 24.1, "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it." It doesn't say the earth is the Lord's except for your diversified stock portfolio and your real estate. And then, even more pointedly, it looks at Leviticus 25.23, where God lays down the legal framework regarding real estate in ancient Israel. The land must not be sold permanently because the land is mine. God is essentially telling the entire nation, you are all just tenants. You are sharecroppers on my estate. I hold the ultimate deed.
Human beings are not ultimate owners. They are temporary stewards of resources that belong to the Creator.
Precisely. And this wasn't just abstract, lofty theology meant to be read in a temple. It was codified into a radical, disruptive economic policy known as the Year of Jubilee.
Okay, we need to dive deep into the Jubilee, because if we just say it was an economic reset, we miss the sheer brilliance of the mechanics. How did it actually work?
Every 50 years, a profound economic reset occurred by divine mandate. Imagine a family in ancient Israel falls on hard times, a drought, a famine, a bad decision. They accrued debt. To pay off that debt, they have to lease out their ancestral land.
They lose their source of income.
Right. In the sharecropping model, or the modern capitalist model, that family might be permanently dispossessed. They become landless peasants forever. But the Year of Jubilee dictated that in the 50th year, the land had to be returned to the original family, free and clear.
So it was a divine mechanism to prevent exactly the kind of permanent economic displacement and generational wealth concentration we've been talking about.
Yes. And the mechanics prove that they truly viewed the land as a lease from God, not a permanent capital asset. When an Israelite sold their land, the price wasn't based on an absolute free market value. The price was calculated on a sliding scale based entirely on how many years were left until the next Jubilee.
That is so smart.
If the Jubilee was 40 years away, the land was expensive because you were buying 40 harvests. If the Jubilee was only 5 years away, the land was cheap because you only got 5 harvests before it reverted back to the original family.
That is brilliant. It protected generational stability. It ensured that no family could be permanently exiled from the means of production, the land, just because of a bad harvest or a crushing debt cycle. It was a built-in systemic safety valve against the sharecropping nightmare and the feudal concentration of power.
If we contrast this ancient wisdom with our modern systems, the irony is incredibly thick. Biblical stewardship, which began by acknowledging God as the ultimate absolute owner, actually served to limit human economic concentration on Earth.
It decentralized power.
It decentralized power and affirmed personal responsibility and dignity at the family and community level.
While our modern digital systems, which operate on the grand illusion of our absolute individual autonomy, my phone, my data, my money, do the exact opposite. They concentrate ultimate economic control into the hands of a very few megacorporations or state apparatuses, while simultaneously dispersing responsibility into a black box of faceless algorithms.
There's no human accountability.
Right. When things go wrong in the modern system, no one is accountable. You can't get a human on the phone, but someone at the top holds all the leverage.
We've mapped out the ancient Roman blueprint. We've traced the historical evolution of economic leverage through manors and company towns. We've unmasked the licensing swindle of the modern access economy, and we've contrasted it with the theological ideal of stewardship. It is a massive amount of conceptual weight.
It really is.
And frankly, it is very easy to look at the sheer scale of modern algorithmic governance, the fusion of banking and identity, and feel a profound, paralyzing sense of despair.
So what do we do? Because the natural reaction to realizing you are living in a digital company town is panic. Do we smash our smartphones? Do we withdraw all our cash, bury gold in the backyard, run to the woods, and build a compound?
No. And as we move into the conclusion of the source material, we find a call for faithfulness in the marketplace that explicitly, categorically rejects panic. Pastor John provides a very comforting yet incredibly firm conclusion.
A deep breath moment.
The appropriate Christian response to programmable economies, digital currencies, and algorithmic control is not to succumb to technological paranoia, because the historical reality is that the church has been here before.
That's the anchor.
It is. The church has survived Roman emperors demanding incense to trade. It's survived medieval kings demanding tribute. It survived modern dictatorships demanding ideological purity. And it is surviving democracies demanding cultural conformity. The economic systems change. The technology updates. But the core challenge of human faithfulness remains exactly the same.
So where's the line in the sand? How do we live in a digital Rome without burning the digital incense?
The boundary is articulated around the purpose of the system. Participating in society, working a job, writing code, treating goods, building a business, utilizing cloud infrastructure to provide for your family is entirely fine and, in fact, necessary when those systems stay in their lane.
When they act as tools.
When they function merely as mechanisms of exchange. But the moment a system crosses that boundary, when it leverages your basic human need to buy and sell in order to demand a moral compromise, or when it asks for an ultimate loyalty that belongs only to God, that is when rigorous, unyielding discernment is required.
Which brings us back beautifully to the true, enduring meaning of the warning in Revelation. It is not a decoder ring for the evening news.
Yeah.
It is not a prophecy about specific computer chips or payment apps. It is a permanent, structural reminder about the nature of power in a fallen world.
Power seeks its own worship.
Economic systems are incredibly powerful, and powerful systems always, eventually, demand loyalty. They cannot help themselves. It is the fundamental nature of consolidated power to seek its own worship. Therefore, your loyalty must always be examined. You cannot put your allegiance on autopilot just because the user interface is pretty.
The ability to buy and sell is important. It is how we survive, how we feed our children, and how we shelter our families. But it is not the most important thing a human being possesses. That ultimate value, that untouchable core, is the soul. And the text leaves us with this poignant, absolute truth. The soul should never, under any circumstances, be traded in the marketplace, no matter how incredibly convenient the two-day shipping happens to be.
If we synthesize this entire intellectual journey, the picture is exceptionally clear. You are currently navigating an access economy that is fundamentally built on revocable licenses, shifting terms of service, and centralized digital infrastructure. Whether you realize it or not, this heavily mirrors the historical tactics of empires from Rome to the company towns that use economic leverage to enforce behavioral and ideological orthodoxy.
It is the same strategy.
The mechanism is cleaner now.
Right.
It's quieter. There are no bloody gladiatorial games. But the leverage is arguably more comprehensive and pervasive than ever before.
This is a direct challenge to your daily life. Tomorrow morning, when you wake up and interact with the digital world, I want you to look at the platforms you rely on. Look at the software subscriptions you depend on to do your daily work. Look at the digital payment apps you use to buy your morning coffee. Look at the cloud servers where you store your family photos and your memories.
Realize what you're interacting with.
Recognize the leverage they hold over you. Simply acknowledge that you are operating within a system of conditional access.
And as you reflect on that reality, consider this final provocative thought. It builds on everything Pastor John has outlined today, but it pushes us to examine our own personal breaking points. If modern technological infrastructure can seamlessly, algorithmically revoke your ability to buy and sell based on shifting terms of service or evolving acceptable use policies, at what point does your pursuit of absolute convenience permanently override your capacity for moral dissent? What is the digital incense you might quietly, almost unthinkingly be asked to burn tomorrow, just to keep your wallet active and your life convenient?
It's a question worth asking before the prompt inevitably appears on your screen.
Thank you for joining us as the third partner in this conversation, and thank you for taking the time to engage in this discernment drop. Stay curious, stay vigilant, and we will catch you next time.